and thanks everybody. I'm excited about this discussion. Today I was going to talk a little bit about designing platforms for the social good. So this is something that I've worked on a lot in my research over the years. I wanted to start with a little bit of broad motivation. At least this is kind of how I started thinking about these topics. Here's a quote from a 2002 Roth paper: "The economic environment evolves, but it's also designed." And I think this is something that's very true in the tech sector. And for me, my motivation has come from these two broad shifts in economics. One has been this idea from Roth and others about the economist as an engineer, taking a more prescriptive lens, diving into the details of the institutional context to try to figure out how to create more efficient designs. And the second parallel movement has been this idea of choice architecture, where there's increasing recognition that we need to think about the choices that we're making and how a choice is being presented to customers and how that's going to affect outcomes. Now, zooming in a little bit to where my work has fit into this, I've been interested in applying these ideas within the tech sector. So Susan Athey and I have a 2019 JEP article thinking about the role that economics and economists have come to play, bringing ideas from the social sciences into companies. For me and for others, I know that this is often focused on understanding and redesigning platforms. Let me zoom in one more level to where I'm going to be thinking about in what I wanted to think about for the next few minutes, leveraging platforms for the social good. So this could mean a lot of different things, and I've worked on things in different areas around this theme, working with platforms to help understand how they could achieve socially good outcomes. So one example is Susan Athey, Kristen Graybarts, Nils Wernefelt, and I have a paper looking at digital public health interventions on Facebook and Instagram, and looking at ways to launch these at scale and evaluate their impact. Another one, we've worked with Yelp looking at digitizing disclosure initiatives. So this is with Daisy Day and I, Ginger, Dan Martin, and I have another paper related to this where we're thinking about how do you design disclosure in the digital age and what are some of the barriers to the disclosure mechanisms that might warrant more work. And the third area is what I want to talk about for the rest of this session, which is designing inclusive platforms. Let me give a little bit of backdrop specifically on that topic that'll motivate the way that I've been thinking about this. One design choice that platforms have thought about differently over the years is the level of anonymity in platform settings. So we can think about some of the early platforms like the eBays, the Amazons, the Pricelines of the world. And one thing that they did is help to facilitate arm's length transactions. You could be sitting in Boston and transact with somebody in Berkeley and not know much about the buyer or seller, and just kind of rely on reviews and these other mechanisms that came up in the last discussion. And that had important implications for efficiency. So kind of more products, lower prices, all of those implications, but also had implications for equity on the platform. And in fact, so some of the early research on this topic posited that this meant that the digital age was going to usher in settings that would have less discrimination because you're removing some of the information that people would use to discriminate based on. But over time, we've seen pretty dramatic and often deliberate shifts toward less anonymity in transactions. So you could see things going back to at least 2010. Here's a quote from a Facebook marketing director saying online anonymity has to go away. Here's a 2013 line from Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, saying, when you remove anonymity, it brings out the best in people. And these weren't just words, actually kind of platforms started making decisions to infuse more information about buyers and sellers before you're making a transaction. And sort of the intended consequence of this was to facilitate trust. And the thing that I've been interested in is that there's also unintended consequences of this, which is that this can facilitate discrimination on a platform by reinfusing information about people you're transacting with. So I've been working on a series of projects thinking about when is this going to lead to discrimination, and are there times where providing information about people you're transacting with might actually mitigate bias or create more inclusivity. So in a paper with Ben Edelman and Dan Svirsky in AJ Apply 2017, we ran a large-scale experiment on Airbnb where we had drawn 6,400 properties that had listed availability 8 weeks out, and we ran a traditional audit study. You've probably seen lots of these in labor markets and elsewhere. So we took this basic idea and we varied only the name and had names that were statistically indicative of race. So names that are more common among African Americans and more common among white Americans, while keeping the rest of the message the same. And we found pretty pervasive discrimination on the platform. Guests with distinctively African American names based on birth records were about 16% less likely to be accepted relative to those with distinctively white names. We found that this was persistent, and the persistence actually is policy relevant because there's actually exceptions, at least in the US, for who would be subject to discrimination laws in housing. So it includes discrimination existed among shared and separate properties, and also hosts with multiple listings. If you look at the paper, we have lots of other heterogeneity in there as well. But let me just kind of zoom forward because I want to talk about the implications of this and also a new project that we've been working on. So in response to our paper, they gave a growing chorus of concerns about discrimination on the platform. Airbnb made a couple of announcements. They had a series of changes, but two I'll focus on here. One, they ended up removing profile pictures until after a transaction was made. So instead of seeing the person who's requesting to book and then deciding whether to accept or reject them, now you have to decide whether to accept or reject a booking request, and then you can see the picture. And the second is a pilot that they're still running that's based on Oregon guests, where they are actually now removing names until after the booking and only showing initials. And actually, this is a pretty common strategy if you think about like the removing of identifying information within economics. There's lots of settings where people have explored this broad idea. So you can think about kind of the Airbnbs and online platforms. We can think about the famous orchestra study looking at people that are auditioning either behind a screen or not. That's a form of removing identifying information about gender and how that had implications for the gender composition of orchestras. Labor markets, so there's platforms that like Applied that are trying to do this, and they're all based on this simple idea, which is identifying information facilitates discrimination, and removing it could help to kind of then reduce discrimination on platform. So in the new paper, Abhay and Asia, Oren Reshef and I have been looking at whether providing information about race can ever increase demand. And our motivation here is that there's a growing number of platforms thinking about, at least in a targeted way, saying, yes, there's discrimination, but there are also areas of the world where there's pent-up demand to provide support for marginalized groups. And where we look at one case study of a platform that designed a feature to help bring attention to Black-owned businesses. What we're interested in is, can these platform design changes leverage consumer demand to help a marginalized group? The empirical context we're going to be looking at is Yelp. In 2020, Yelp launched a feature that highlighted Black-owned businesses, and it allowed Black-owned businesses to opt in to receive a label and to be more easily found in search. And they allowed consumers to search for Black-owned businesses near them. Let me just give a preview of the analysis because I know we're on a tight time frame here and I want to stick to it. So what we do in the paper is we compare demand at businesses after relative to before the launch of the feature for Black-owned businesses relative to all other businesses looking within the restaurant industry. We're going to have a series of outcomes. We actually have outcomes on the platform, outcomes off the platform. On the platform, we look at clicks to the business, orders via the platform, and then we now have been able to merge in data from SafeGraph, so cell phone pings, to see if there's also additional people going to the restaurant afterwards. Then what we're able to do is look at some heterogeneity with an eye toward thinking about mechanisms. And the two flavors of things we do are looking across neighborhoods to try to get a sense of where the effect is larger or smaller, and also looking at who the marginal consumers are, who are the people being drawn in by the feature, to give us a sense of the racial composition of the new demand that's coming in as a result. Here's a quick preview of the results, and I'll give a little bit more context afterwards. But the new feature increased demand for Black-owned businesses. This was true both for on-platform metrics, but also true for the SafeGraph data, suggesting that this is an economically meaningful effect for businesses. Now, the effect was larger in areas that were predominantly white, higher income, and Democratic leaning. And we also find that the new customers for Black-owned businesses after the feature was introduced were more likely to be white relative to prior customers. And this is important for us because we were thinking about, is this reflecting homophily? So just somebody who wants to support someone within their own group, or is this something that you might think about as allyship, where there's a broader set of demand to help Black-owned businesses or support Black-owned businesses? Now, here's a quick snapshot of what the feature looks like. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things listed up top. One of them is Black-owned. That is the feature. And 2 ways people find businesses would either be clicking on that or searching for Black-owned restaurants. And if you click on a restaurant, they also have a tag on there, a badge that allows people to see. So this isn't the only way people find restaurants on Yelp. So here's an example of a restaurant. Black-owned restaurants. Jamaica Plain is one of the common searches that people that got to Luohan Cafe by, but they also got there by the existing channels on Yelp: breakfast sandwich, Jamaica Plain; coffee shop, Jamaica Plain. And businesses were, again, opting in with this. In our analysis, we're basically going to be looking at 2 things. First, we're going to look at the timing of the launch to give us clean identification on businesses that are where the timing is pretty exogenous. And then we're going to look at staggered adoption over time. Here's just a quick snapshot of results, just so we can give people a sense. We see pretty dramatic and pretty fast increases, so we're pretty comfortable thinking that this is the effect of the feature rather than other demand shifts that are happening at the time. Like, kind of pick your outcome of choice here. This is page views, website visits, calls to the restaurant, orders on the platform, and revenue coming through orders. And across the board, you see the effects here. Yeah. Now, let me kind of dive a little bit into this heterogeneity, because I do think this is important for understanding the mechanisms. One hypothesis is just that whatever you make salient is going to drive demand. But actually, our results seem to suggest that it depends on what the underlying demand function is and what people seem to care about in an area. And the way that we get at this is look at heterogeneity in political preferences. So just an institutional detail is that within the United States, there's a pretty big political divide on views of race. So for example, this is just from a Pew survey. If you survey people who are Republican or lean Republican, there's only 16% of white adults who support the Black Lives Matter movement. Whereas if you look at Democratic leaning and Democratic white adults, there's 88% support. So there's good reason to think that there might be heterogeneity in the underlying demand for supporting a Black-owned business. And in fact, when we take that to the data, we merge in voter data on Democratic leaning and Republican leaning areas and see essentially the entire effect is being driven by majority Democratic areas, which suggests that this is an interaction of the design choice the platform is making, the launch of the feature, and also the underlying demand of customers. Again, we're able to look at who are the marginal customers. I'll just sort of dive right into it. So we do this in 2 ways. We look at the demographics of the area, and we find that the result is being driven predominantly by less Black areas, and areas that had a high % Black population didn't see a spike in demand. And consistent with that, we code up the race of reviewers based on their pictures using an algorithm called Deep Face. And we see that the effect is being driven by non-Black reviewers, and that there's a shift toward more non-Black reviewers among Black-owned businesses that get added. So let me just take the last minute and a half and sort of wrap up like where we are in this project and the way that we've been thinking about this. I don't take these results to mean that racial bias is not a problem, even in this context. Racial bias is obviously prevalent in lots of settings. And in most settings, if you run an audit study and you're identifying race, there seems to be at least some extent of discrimination, and targeted anonymity can be helpful. But there's also important social movements that are kind of varying across geography and across preferences that are aimed at supporting historically marginalized groups. And at least in this setting, increasing the salience of race in a targeted way seems to have the potential to help marginalized groups. Let me just kind of recap the results a little bit and zoom out one more layer. So the support doesn't seem to be coming from other members of marginalized groups, perhaps because they already knew about these businesses, but it seems that it's non-Black restaurant goers that are learning about and then going to Black-owned restaurants. but that the effect seems to depend on the political preferences in the area and driven predominantly by majority Democrat areas. So zooming out even more, kind of thinking about designing of inclusive platforms, this says something about the need for more nuanced theories of race. What our preference is, how can a platform make design choices that will create inclusivity? And zooming out even one more level, just for in the spirit of this conference, I think this is an example of the potential for research on the digital economy. This provides testing ground for existing theories and ideas, but also raises new research questions and opportunities to pretty directly inform practice through research. So let me just stop here and thank you.
Thank you, Michael.